Shalom. It's good to be back in Israel after some time. I was remembering today that one of the things I did in the 1990s here in Israel when I was with the U.S. State Department was to try to convince the Israeli government that there was a role in Israel's security for arms control. And that was an uphill fight, but I think Israel recognized over time that there was some value in arms control. Arms control is seldom said these days in the same breath as the word cyber, but my proposition today is that we need to start thinking about it a lot more, thinking about cyber peace through the concept of cyber arms control. I've had the benefit of having a career of 15 years in cyber policy, but also a career of 20 years in arms control. And so what I want to talk to you today about is the connection between arms control and cybersecurity that we can and should build. Why we should build it, how we should build it, and how we should start. Sometimes when you're watching the news every day, you can fail to have perspective. And when major events happen, sometimes they're not fully appreciated or fully remarked upon. 5 days ago, only 5 days ago, something happened momentous in the issue of cybersecurity. And it happened in a little place called Rancho Mirage in California. Arguably the two most powerful men in the world, the President of the United States and the President of China, sat down together for one-on-one talks about their major bilateral issues. That in and of itself has happened before. It's happened over the course of the last 30 years. But this meeting was the first time that the number one issue on the agenda was cybersecurity. 2 years ago, 3 years ago, when some of us advocated getting that issue on the agenda, we had difficulty. But in the wake of the cyber attacks that have occurred on the United States and throughout the world in the course of the last couple of years, only the last couple of years, the agenda item of cybersecurity was created, and now the agenda item of cybersecurity is number one on U.S.-Chinese discussions. Now, naturally, at the first meeting of these two men to talk about cybersecurity, there was not agreement. The United States accused China of having attacks on American companies, industrial espionage attacks, launched by the People's Liberation Army. The Army of China attacking American companies and European companies and companies throughout the world. The Chinese president responded in kind that China, too, was the victim of many cyber attacks. He also denied a lot of what the United States alleged was coming from the Chinese government. So progress was not made. But the two men agreed to put it on the agenda again, to have working group discussions in the meantime, and to try to develop rules of the road for both nations' activities in cyberspace. Well, rules of the road are another way of describing arms control. So let's, for a moment, step back and think about arms control and what it accomplished and where it began. The arms control of the 1980s and the 1990s. When arms control began in the 1980s and 1990s, it was universally greeted by the media, by academics, by commentators, with skepticism. They said arms control between the United States and the Soviet Union, arms control on a multilateral global basis or regional basis, such as in Europe, was just going to be too hard. There were technical issues involved that diplomats couldn't understand. Technical issues about engineering, about missiles, about satellites, about telemetry, about nuclear physics, biological sciences. This was going to be too hard to get into a diplomatic agreement. And moreover, people said, the other side will cheat. You can't get verification of anything that's significant. And they said, no one will agree to limit anything of significance. Well, what happened? The United States and the Soviet Union proceeded over the course of 20 years to negotiate very difficult, very technical agreements with very intrusive verification measures, including anytime, anywhere inspection in each other's countries, lots of advance notification, lots of exchange of information, lots of confidence-building measures. And they agreed to treaties to limit nuclear weapons, to destroy nuclear weapons, to limit delivery vehicles, to limit nuclear tests, all on a bilateral basis. And on a multilateral basis, the United States, the Soviet Union, Europeans, and others agreed on treaties to abolish biological weapons, to abolish chemical weapons, to have confidence-building measures about the conduct of military forces and the activity of military forces, and to have vast withdrawals of forces from Central Europe. All of that was accomplished. And it made a lot of people safer. It's worth remembering that that was accomplished, and it's worth remembering that when we started out on that process, we were told, just as we are told today about cyber arms control, that it couldn't be done. So when you hear today, as you will from others, that cybersecurity doesn't lend itself to arms control, remember that's what they said about all the other arms control agreements as well. You will hear people say about cyber arms control that it's too technical, that diplomats don't understand it, and that's largely true. You'll hear them say that it can't be verified, that there is an attribution problem. In fact, in a moment, you're going to hear a detailed presentation on the attribution problem. I think the attribution problem, from my perspective, has been overblown. That in point of fact, governments, intelligence agencies, can, most of the time, figure out who is engaged in cyber attacks. Yes, identities can be spoofed, and yes, it can be difficult to know in every instance, but most of the time, cyber intelligence agencies can figure out who's doing the attacks. So verification is possible. It doesn't have to be 100%. It just has to be adequate. So what could cyber arms control look like? What might we start out with? Let me suggest that one thing that we could begin with would be a mutual agreement, an international agreement, not to attack and alter financial records, not to attack the financial services sector, banks, stock markets, and alter financial records or alter bank accounts. As far as I can tell, no government in the world today is doing that. Cyber criminals may be doing that, but I have yet to notice a government do that. And I have noticed governments refusing to do that. In fact, in 2003, as the United States was getting ready to invade Iraq, a group of advisors went to President Bush and said to him, before you attack Iraq in physical space, you can attack it in cyberspace. We have the capability, they said, to hack into the Iraqi banks and to transfer funds from the Iraqi banks to our own. In short, by hacking, we can make Saddam Hussein pay for the American invasion. It sounded like a good idea until we thought about it a bit more. And thinking about it a bit more, you realize that the international finance and banking sector depends on trust. It depends on confidence. It depends on believing those numbers. And if you cannot trust the numbers in the banking sector, if you cannot trust what's in your bank account, if you cannot trust who owns that stock, if you cannot trust the price when that stock was traded, then the whole system begins to unravel. And so President Bush, who very seldom made wise decisions, made that wise decision. And Saddam Hussein kept his money for a while. No one is engaged in this, so it is something that we could start out at. Arms control, in the history of arms control, it begins by having countries agree not to do things that they are already not doing. Not to do things that they don't want to do. That's how it starts. So we could start with such an international pledge not to attack the financial services sector and change the numbers. We might go on from there. We might go on from there to say, going back to the law of war, going back over 100 years of arms control treaties, to say that we will not use cyber weapons to target, specifically to target, medical facilities. We all know what a cyber attack on a medical facility could do. Think for a minute of attacking a hospital's database and changing the blood types of patients. Just that one thing, just altering, scrambling medical records to change the patient's blood types could result in many deaths and could result in destabilizing the entire medical system in a city. So there are little first steps that we could take. But in the larger picture, what we need is an international system that allows a nation that is under attack from a DDoS, from an advanced persistent threat attack, to report that attack. If Israel thinks that an attack against a bank here, let's say a DDoS attack against a bank here, is emanating from a server, let's say in Cairo, for example, Israel should be able, through an international system, to say that attack is ongoing, to tell the government of Egypt, and the government of Egypt should have an international obligation to assist, an international obligation to respond, to find that server and shut it down. And there should be some sort of international secretariat that will record that action, that will record the time and the date that Israel said it was under attack, and record how well the government of Egypt did in responding to that request. So that over time there will be developed a record of what nations are cooperating, what nations are honoring their international obligation to assist, and what nations are not. And there could be sanctions, there could be some response to nations that are non-cooperative. That international secretariat that recorded these requests for assistance could do other things. It could have, like the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, it could have international inspection teams that would be available to assist a country that needed it, that needed technical assistance when it was under attack, just as Estonia needed it in 2007, just as Georgia needed it in 2008. But that international team could also include a group of international forensic experts that could go into a country like Estonia in 2007 or Georgia in 2008 and try on an international basis to prove where the attack came from, to prove who did the attack, so that we will know what nation was violating international agreements and international understandings. There are parallels in things like the IAEA. There are parallels in other organizations that aren't specifically arms control. Take a look, for example, at the issue of money laundering. Money laundering was a problem for narcotics. It was a problem for terrorism. And what happened? A group of like-minded nations got together and created something called the Financial Action Task Force, a very light, thin international body, not a big UN bureaucracy. And the Financial Action Task Force began by agreeing among themselves, among the like-minded nations, on the standards for anti-money laundering laws. And they came up with an international standard that all nations in the group then passed as their domestic law, saying what they would do to combat international money laundering. And then they audited each other to make sure that each nation was honoring those commitments. And then they said to the outlaw states, the states that were money laundering havens, they said as a group to those states, if you don't pass these laws and enforce these laws, we will no longer clear your currencies. So it wasn't just the United States going to a money laundering country and making a diplomatic protest. It was a group of the 15 largest economies in the world at the time going to these money laundering recalcitrant states and saying, either you live up to these standards that we have created for you, or we as a group will impose sanctions upon you. There's a lesson in the Financial Action Task Force for how we should think about dealing with arms control in cyberspace. To date, the discussions of arms control in cyberspace have been in a UN forum. A UN forum where nations like Russia and China have used the forum largely for propaganda purposes, have used the forum largely to make political points. The UN is not the place to start cyber arms control. I need hardly tell an audience in Israel that there are problems with the UN. Instead, I would suggest that we begin in cyber arms control as we began in money laundering, with a group of like-minded nations. Like-minded nations who could then set up standards for behavior. Like-minded nations that could then agree to mutual obligations of assistance. And they will have to pass new laws, new domestic laws, in order to enforce those standards. For example, if Israel finds that there is a server in Houston, Texas, that is the source of malware attacking here in Israel, the United States will have to have a law in place, which it does not today, to take that international request for assistance and act, to be able quickly, within hours, to go before a judge and get a warrant and go and seize the server. That can't happen today. But if we had an international agreement, even an informal one, then we could pass domestic legislation like that, and other countries could as well. And if there were these understandings about rules of the road among the group of like-minded nations, then if there were outlier countries, as there were with money laundering, then we together as a group could go to those states and say, stop this kind of activity or else. And we could develop sanctions, just as we did in various other arms control and other international agreements. What might that look like? Well, if there were a nation that consistently was engaged in cyber espionage or had become a haven for cyber criminals, a nation that was a scofflaw, a nation that did not live up to the international standards that were agreed upon, then the like-minded nations could do several things. They could deny visas to people from that country who were engaged in cyber activities. That's the first step. That's the low end of the spectrum. At the high end of the spectrum, if there were a nation that was consistently engaged in cyber espionage and in breaking international norms, the like-minded nations could limit the bandwidth going in and out of that country. Now, I know what you're thinking. I know you're thinking that would be difficult to do, it would be expensive, it would require a lot of people to agree. Yes, it would. But the price that the world is paying today for cybercrime and cyber espionage is a very high one. And so it's not inconceivable at all that a group of like-minded nations could say, we're not going to connect to that country anymore at a high bandwidth. In fact, every packet going to and from that country is going to be inspected, is going to be scanned, is going to be slowed down and quarantined. Yes, technically difficult. No, not technically impossible. And the threat of that kind of international action by like-minded nations may actually get us progress in moving ahead on agreement to international norms and obedience to those international norms. So what happened 5 days ago was momentous, even though the media didn't cover it quite that way. 5 days ago, we took a momentous step in the history of international diplomacy with regard to cybersecurity. But there are many, many more steps to take. And the history of arms control in the 80s and 90s tells us that these journeys in arms control can sometimes take 10 and 15 and even 20 years to negotiate and implement. But the journeys are worth it, because if history is a lesson to us, international agreements, while they are not a panacea, while they are not a substitute for national security programs, they can minimize problems, they can mitigate problems, they can contribute to national security, they can contribute to international stability. Not a panacea, not an overall solution, but something worth doing. And so what I commend to all of you is to pause and go back and study the arms control, bilateral and multilateral of the 1980s and 1990s. Learn the lessons from that recent past, and then think together about how we can craft international arms control agreements in cyberspace. I know there are skeptics here in the audience, but I will be glad to meet you here 20 years from now and see what great progress has been made. People will make it. You can be among those people. We need the intellectual powerhouse of Israel and Israel's academic and security experts to contribute to this process. And for the United States, my message is fine, have talks with the Chinese, have talks with the Russians, have talks with the UN. But really, if you're going to start and make progress, first, have talks with like-minded nations. Have talks with your friends. Start with your friends. And the United States has no greater friend than Israel. Thank you very much.